Good morning, all. Nice to catch up with you. And this is the first of the narrated PowerPoints that we're doing for the Theme 1 booklet, Markets, Consumers and Firms. And it's basically Chapter 15 on page 77 in your booklets. How do banks and businesses cope with risk? Okay, so this presentation will be posted onto Teams, and you'll get a chance to be able to take a look at it and obviously work through any of the slides and any of the information within that. This will get followed up with a tutorial that we will do on Monday there during the double, so that any questions that you might have based on any of the presentations, obviously we can address those during that time. Okay, so the thing we're going to be looking at is the role of credit in the economy, and specifically the way in which risk and liability is dealt with, if you like. Now, this is a relatively short PowerPoint. There's only 5 slides within it, so it's going to act as quite a good test. And then my plan will be to also look at the next subject, which is very closely related to risk and liability, and as far as banks are concerned, and that is different sources of finance that businesses might use. So the plan will be to do those two, and then use those as the basis for our tutorial, which will be coming up on Monday of next week. Okay, so without further ado, as I think I mentioned to you in our last sort of conversation, some of the slides actually ask you to do certain activities, and clearly you can do those independently. But also ask yourself a question: do you think yourself as a risk taker, or are you risk averse? What sort of things influence your decision making process in terms of taking risk? And why do you think that entrepreneurs choose to take risks when they set up businesses? Clearly, anybody who's choosing to do something for themselves is taking a little bit of a risk. So some questions to sort of think about, and then obviously we'll look at explanations of that as we go through the rest of the presentation. Okay. One of the things that I mentioned previously is, as we're going through this process, obviously feel free to take notes and add notes to your sort of revision notes on each of these subject areas, but also don't be afraid to ask a question or have a question noted in your notes if there's any bits that you're thinking, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, or can you explain that in a bit more detail, and we can use that as the basis for our discussions in tutorials. Okay, so let's see how we go. So first things first, then we're going to look at the meaning of risk and also the implications of two things. One thing is something called limited liability. The other is called unlimited liability. Those two concepts are very important when it comes to the way in which different businesses choose to set themselves up, and we'll come back to look at that in a minute. So we'll do that as we go. First things first, then, risk and uncertainty. There are some notes, as you can see to the left-hand side, on the difference between risk and uncertainty, and that's something that you can take a look at independently. And also the role of risk and uncertainty in business. If there's not really a better example of uncertainty in businesses as we go through, the second lockdown, third lockdown, and however many lockdowns it is, but clearly the uncertainty of what might happen in the future is something that is causing lots of businesses lots of strife and anxiety at the moment to try and decide how they're going to take that forward in the future. One of the big issues with both of those things, both risk and uncertainty, is trying to deal with unknowns, isn't it? And sometimes, fear of the unknown or not knowing what's going to happen is something that can give us the collywobbles at the very least. So clearly there's an element of that needs to be borne in mind. Okay. If we're thinking about risks, then to some degree it may well be possible to quantify the level of risk or degree of risk, and consider the probability of if this happens, or what's the likelihood of this happening, so that you can effectively try and manage your risk to some degree, which is something that lots of businesses will try to do. Clearly, to some degree, risks are measurable. You can say, well, if we do this, this could happen, and so there is a means by which you can be reasonably smart about it. So if it's measurable, you can see how that risk might affect a business, either in a positive or a negative way. But if we talk about uncertainties, well, in some cases, it's not necessarily possible to quantify it with a probability, because the fact that things are uncertain means that you don't. The outcome is too unpredictable. You can't actually. If there's uncertainty, you can't predict exactly what's going to happen, and the very nature or definition of uncertainty is that it's a difficult thing to try to predict, and as a result of that, it's clearly not that easy to measure either. Okay. Every business decision is to some degree going to involve some sort of risk and some sort of uncertainty, because unless you know exactly what's going to happen, or you've got a contract that you definitely know you're going to get, every decision that you make within a business is going to involve risking some capital, maybe spending some money, making a decision to expand or to reduce your production capabilities. All of those things will have a certain risk attached to it, and clearly there will be some uncertainty too. Let's have a look at examples of risk in business then. Clearly, if we take an entrepreneur, somebody who's decided that they're going to set up in business, they are taking a risk every time that you decide that you're going to set up a business. To some degree, you're taking a risk because you're committing resources. You're not necessarily sure of the outcome, and to some degree, if you want to be a successful entrepreneur, they do say that most successful entrepreneurs have failed at least 4 or 5 times before they found the true thing that they have got success from, and clearly that takes quite a resilient personality and somebody who is willing to say, well, okay, I'll take this risk. Hopefully it's a calculated risk. If it doesn't work out, well, I'll find another way of making it work. And that learning process is certainly something that happens quite a lot in enterprise education, because lots of people believe that lots of entrepreneurs are successful at their first attempt, and actually the truth is that in most instances entrepreneurs have had to have a go at 2, 3, maybe even 4 times to become successful. Thinking about the risks that you might take if you're an entrepreneur. So let's say, for instance, you might have found a nice steady job working for somebody, getting paid a salary each month, but in order to take the plunge, you might then have to give up that paid employment in order to concentrate all of your efforts on your new venture. Another risk could be that in order to do that, you're going to have to put personal savings into any venture, and in lots of instances, because if you're moving from being in paid employment to essentially having no turnover to start with and no track record, well, more often than not, it's quite a difficult process to get finance for your business, and you're probably going to need to invest some personal savings or personal family loan maybe, or some redundancy, whatever it might be, in order to have a go at this new venture. And in some cases that may not work, so clearly there's a risk attached to that. The other thing that you're putting at risk is your personal esteem and reputation. So nobody likes to fail, and it's a difficult one for lots of people to cope with. And so clearly, if you're feeling like it hasn't quite worked out the way that you would like it to, that might then affect your business reputation, but also your own view as to your capabilities. But again, being able to sort of dust yourself off, learn something from the process, and actually then think, okay, well, if I do this again, I'm going to do that slightly differently, and I might finance it slightly differently, etc. So it becomes a learning sort of iterative process, if you like. Again, in some instances, if you're investing your own personal savings, dependent on the type of business and the way in which you set it up, in some cases, your family homes and your possessions might be at risk as well. So if you have what's called unlimited liability, and we'll come back to that and look at that in a bit more detail, then that could mean that if your business is unsuccessful, then you might end up having to use some of your own personal assets to pay off any bills that maybe you've generated, which clearly can be a tricky one at the very least. Okay, so clearly, so that's an example there of somebody taking sort of personal charge of their destiny by becoming an entrepreneur, but there are clearly some risks involved too. But financial institutions are also taking risk when they're lending money to people. Okay, so banks and building societies and other sources of finance are taking risk when they're lending money to individuals or businesses. Okay, to some degree they're going to have to assess whether they're going to get it paid back. And clearly, if they don't get it paid back, then they've got a bit of a problem, haven't they? In some cases, you can, as a financial institution, if you're lending something, lending a significant amount of money, you might actually secure that loan against a particular asset. So the classic example would be if somebody's choosing to buy a house and they're going to need to borrow some money via a mortgage, then that's what's known as a secured loan. So essentially, the loan that is taken out is secured against the value of the asset that's being bought, in this case, your house. Okay. If we're talking about financial institutions, some financial institutions will lend to both businesses and individuals. Okay, and in a situation where if you're a financial institution lending money to a business, what happens if that business fails? Well, clearly, depending on the type of loan that you're offering, you might be able to sell one of the assets if you've secured that loan against an asset, or alternatively, you might end up taking a bath and not getting that money repaid. So in some instances, you might also find that other risks that different businesses might take. A supplier might choose to provide goods or services on credit. Okay, so in order for people to buy a particular product or service, they might need the supplier of that good might choose to give the customer some extra time to pay, and that they do that by offering credit terms. Okay, so it might be that you might, let's say you're going to buy a van for your business. You might say, well, okay, we're going to we'll take out some sort of loan, or we might take it out on credit. So we might say, well, okay, we don't expect you to pay for that straight away. We'll give you 6 months to pay that, and that sometimes is if other businesses are doing business in that way, then in some cases you might need to do that too. But clearly, a supplier is taking a risk as far as that's concerned, because some people, unfortunately, if they have credit or cash flow problems, then that might mean that they're not able to pay that money back, and that clearly is another form of risk. Okay, is the supplier going to get paid? Okay, if not, how much have they lost? Now, clearly, if a supplier is providing lots and lots of sales, or lots and lots of people the goods and services, but not getting paid for them until sometime in the future, then in that case that obviously can be a bit of a problem, a financial problem for them if they've got too much credit that's owed to them and that's not going to get paid back. Okay, let's see if I can move that down a bit so that I can see the whole thing. I'm not sure whether I can. And obviously, in this instance, it might well be that if that's the amount of money that's that's being put out on credit is a significant amount, how much is that going to damage the business? And clearly, that in some cases, if you provide your goods and services on credit, and you have too high an amount of goods and services on credit, then that clearly can be an issue in terms of the losses that that a business might incur. Okay, so that's a little bit about risk. Let's take a look at now at limited and unlimited liability, and this is to do with the way in which businesses structure, or businesses might choose to structure themselves. Okay, so we take something called limited liability. That essentially means that any business that sets up with something called limited liability is only literally their commitments and are only limited to the total amount that they've invested or promised in share capital. Okay, so let's say, for instance, somebody decides they're going to set up a new business and they put £10,000 in of their own money. If they've got what's known as a limited liability company, that would mean that if let's say the business wasn't particularly successful and it ran up £30,000 worth of debt, okay, the business owner, in this case the investor, if they've got a company that's been set up with limited liability, would only be responsible for that £10,000 that they'd put in the first place, which clearly would be, not a very good thing to lose. But in this instance, the way that the structure works is that the business is a separate legal entity from the individual. Okay, so you'll often see companies that are called, let's say in this case, Collins Computers Limited. Okay, well, the fact that there's a limited after the name suggests that, number one, I've got a limited liability. Okay, which means that in this instance, the company is a separate legal entity from me as an individual. Okay, so effectively, if my company runs up debts, okay, I'm only responsible for the amount of money that I've invested in that particular business, not for the total that the business has run up. Okay, that means that effectively, an investor's personal belongings are protected and don't have to get involved. You don't have to get involved in selling your house or selling your assets in order to pay money back from a business that has actually run into trouble. Okay, whether that's the way that you should choose to go about it, or whether that's a bit more of a moral dilemma, really, and a moral question. But in terms of the legal position, if you have a limited liability company, you're only responsible for the amount of money that you've invested in the first place into the business. Okay, you'd lose that, but you wouldn't then get involved in paying your own using your own personal belongings to pay any of the debts that the business has run up, as opposed to you as an individual. The older alternative is something known as unlimited liability, which is pretty much the opposite of what I've just described. Okay, so in that situation, the owners of a business are responsible for the total amount of debt of the business. Okay, now it tends to be certain types of business, for instance, sole traders, which most people, when they first set up businesses, tend to become sole traders. Most sole traders have got what's called unlimited liability. Okay, so it means that if we take the scenario that I just described previously, let's say we set up a business, we've actually invested £10,000 of savings in order to set the business up as a sole trader, and then we end up running into difficulties, and we end up making a loss of £30,000. Okay, well, in that case, with unlimited liability, not only would we lose the £10,000 that we invested, we would also be responsible for the other £20,000, which essentially is the loss that you've made. And in that case, you are responsible. If you're if you've got unlimited liability, that means that you would have to sell some of your personal assets in order to pay off those debts. And examples that could include personal belongings, homes, cars, and they would be to the value of the debts that the business has run up. Okay, so it's a really important principle when it comes to deciding on the way in which you might want to structure a business in the future, if you choose to do that. Unlimited liability companies are very easy to set up, not very expensive to set up, but clearly there are some disadvantages to that, in that if you have got unlimited liability and you run into difficulties, then you end up getting involved in selling some of your personal assets. If you've chosen to go down a limited liability route and become a limited company, you are literally limiting your liability, and lots of businesses choose to do that because clearly it means that they're not in quite such a precarious, risky situation. They will still lose any original investment that they might have in a business, but they're not going to have to pay back any debts that the business has created based on selling their own assets in order to pay those things back. Clearly, unlimited liability is seen as high risk, because if you lose control of your finances, then effectively you're having to then pay back any debts that are generated based on your own selling some of your own assets in some cases. So that's the first part of the presentation, really talking about spreading risk, and also this principle of limited and unlimited liability. Now, when we start to look at ways in which businesses might choose to finance themselves, and some of the advantages and disadvantages of limited liabilities and limited liability and unlimited liability, that will then have an effect on the different options that you might choose to consider when it comes to how you might finance a business. Okay, so thanks for listening. I'll post this onto Teams, and you can take a look independently. It will be a link that will take you to a YouTube channel, and then you can watch it to your heart's content. Okay, so thanks for listening.